Well, happy Valentine's Day, everybody. This is kind of the ultimate love letter that we're going to be exploring, which is to say, the last love letter ever to be written. George and I are hoping to explore some of the dynamics of how we envision the end. You know, what is the future as we envision it, and how is the future shaped by the biblical imagination, and how does the biblical imagination intersect with various scientific scenarios that are also conjured through various study. So if last time we were looking at, Mary was, if you will, providing us an exploration of the anatomy of desire, today's presentation is really going to be focusing something on the dynamics of the imagination. The imagination, as you know, is what holds the power of breaking the spell of the here and now. It is the power that enables us to envision a beyond. It equips us to defy that gravitational pull of reality and to envision what's possible. The imagination is such a critical dynamic within our psyches, our hearts, minds, and spirits. And in large measure, it undergirds the very possibility of doing ethics, for example. Ethics is that discipline, if you will, of moving from what is the case to imagining and constructing what ought to be the case. And in a similar way, metaphysics hinges on this power of imagination, the capacity to transcend the immediate and to envision a world that is outside of our powers of manipulation and management, that there is a realm, if you will, outside of our control that breaks in and has to be taken into consideration. And finally, as George can explicate in much greater depth, the power of imagination in the work of doing science is huge. And despite any empirical or pretensions to empiricism, the fact is the imagination has everything to do with the capacity to move beyond what seems to be the case to try to arrive at a clearer, sharper understanding of what may indeed be the case. And that means breaking the spell, if you will, of what our senses deliver to us of the world. So the power of imagination is huge, and it is a good question for us to ponder. To what degree does life in our religious community actually inspire the imagination? My kids sometimes say it was good for our imaginations because when the sermon was going on and all that stuff, we had to imagine ourselves someplace else. But be that as it may, there is a particular facet or dynamic of the imagination that I want to look at today. And we might talk about the narrative quality of the imagination. In other words, the underlying assertion being that we are inveterate, incurable storytellers. And it's the process, if you will, of creating a story that allows us to extract or to discern meaning within life's experiences. So we are constantly, if you will, taking that raw experience that we have and fitting it into a narrative. We do that with the stories of our lives. I can remember Rabbi Joel Zaman once being in a small group, and he gets in somebody's face and says, "Who are you?" You know, and anxiety begins to mount, and he keeps pressing this question. This is, well, I'm a mother. You know, yeah, well, that tells you something, but who are you really? Well, I have 3 kids, and okay. And he kept pressing, and none of the questions seemed to be satisfying him. And the point that he finally arrived at was, look, the only way I will come to know you is if you tell me your story. I mean, I need to know how you construct the world in which you live, and you do that narratively. I want to know your story. I want to know the hopes and dreams that animate you. You tell me your story, then I can begin to know you a little bit. And that is part of the romance of, I think, of that encounter and that movement towards intimacy, is coming to know somebody on the inside and to know something of their story. So the story, of course, requires a past, a present, and a future. You know, a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And the Bible tells a whole variety of stories, and it operates with a variety of different endings. If you will, to use the fancy theological terms, there are dueling eschatologies within the Bible. There are competing ways in which one envisions the end. And I just teased out 3 which we sent to you. The first one is the narrative from Ecclesiastes. But let me back up just a second before we get into the biblical text, because I sent you a Flannery O'Connor story, which may have you scratching your head a little bit. And I want you to see the method behind my madness. Some years ago, a wonderful Gilman teacher, Carrie Woodward, invited me to come to a class that he was teaching on short stories. And he said, you can pick out any short story you want, pick out one you love, and share it with the kids, and set up a searching conversation. So I chose one of my favorite and probably best-known Flannery O'Connor short story called "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And how many of you have read "A Good Man is Hard to Find"? Or yeah, you know this story. So, in a nutshell, there's this rather manipulative grandmother who's very recognizable for some of us, who has a way of getting her way and knows how to, if you will, get the family to comply with her own desires. So the family's about to go on a vacation, and somehow, you know, as much as they'd like to leave her, she is able to squeeze into the back seat with the kids. And not only that, but she, against the wishes of her son, manages to take a cat in a box with her, concealing, and they go on this trip, and they have these funny antics along the way, and you're yucking it up. I mean, it's delightfully told, and it's really quite amusing. They stop for lunch and discover that there is somebody who has escaped from prison who goes by the name of the Misfit. This is the title he's given, and the Misfit is one mean son of a gun. And he's got a couple of sidekicks with him, and so there's this, you know, this foreboding sense that the Misfit's out there waiting for whoever happens into his clutches. So they get back in the car, they're driving along, and the grandmother has this notion, it's kind of a vision of a house that she had visited when she was a kid. And there was a funny character who was trying to court her. And so she has these really happy memories, and she kind of vaguely recognizes this area, so she finally cajoles the son into turning off on this side road to try to find this house. And she does it by manipulating the kids by saying, you know, I remember this house, it had a secret compartment where there was lots of treasure and silver and gold and all this bounty. So the kids are, you know, they're punching their father's kidneys through the driver's seat until the father yields to their yammering, and they drive down this road. And as they're driving down this road, the grandmother has this horrific realization that they're in Florida, but the episode and the house was actually in a totally different state. So it's at that moment that, lo and behold, the cat jumps out, latches onto the father. The father is freaked out and drives the car off the road, and it tumbles over and spills. The kids are enormously excited because they've just experienced an accident. And they notice on the hill, as they're crawling out of the car, this vehicle on the crest. And the vehicle slowly but surely approaches, and out of the vehicle pops none other than the misfit and his two sidekicks. So this was the story that I gave them, and I didn't give them the ending, and their assignment was to read the story and then to craft their own conclusion as to what they imagined happened. How would they bring a story like this to a conclusion? Okay. Now, the hypothesis being that their worldview would be encoded in the ways in which they envision an ending. So paying attention to how their imaginations went to work might hold a mirror up for them to see something of themselves reflected. So they come back, and I'll tell you more about how they handle this story. But what I saw were patterns, and there were sort of three patterns that got played out that really resonate with the biblical imagination. One pattern is sort of consonant with what we see in Ecclesiastes. I have it down as a sort of cyclical view of history. But let me just read a couple of lines to you. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then jumping down to 8, all things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. So, if you're operating with this as your paradigm, what's the sense? What's the feeling? I mean, it'd be fun to really explicate all of these and do, intensive literary critiques and blah, blah, spell out the interior character and how this is rooted in a historical and literary context. We can't do that, not only because of my own incompetencies, but because we just don't have the time. So we'll just take a couple of snapshots. But what's your impression of Ecclesiastes? And Mimi?
It would be total disaster if God would finish them all for, it'd be a very glorious.
Yeah.
What are, the interaction of this Ecclesiastes?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's right. It's a world of absurdity in large measure. It's a world where, the proverbial stuff happens. But other responses to this, yeah.
Well, what goes around comes around. There's no real motivation for trying to make any changes.
Yeah.
It's a cyclical pattern.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, to some degree, what you can see in the author of Ecclesiastes is both a sense of exasperation and exhaustion. That there are questions that the world presents that the mind can't wrap itself around, and every attempt to try to come to grips with them collapses on itself. It just doesn't stack up. You know, there is no discernible order to things. And if you secularize Ecclesiastes, what you get is a kind of raw cynicism about anything making any difference. What?
Nihilism.
Yeah, a kind of nihilism.
Yeah, it's I tend to believe, because it's a biblical text, that that's a version of it.
Yes, I do too.
However, it is preeminent and prevalent in our culture.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like almost the guidepost. People would actually use this as a justification of that position.
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
seems contrary.
Yeah.
That's certainly not what it's there.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. But that's I think that's exactly right. The cynicism, I think, is an overlay, a modern overlay. But nevertheless, you can see how one could squeeze out or draw a kind of cynicism from this text. Yeah, Ted?
Harold Bloom, the Yale literary critic, calls Vanity of Vanities a brilliant mistranslation. The Hebrew word, he points out, is hubble, which really means vapor and nothing.
Yes, right. That's right. And it's the same word, by the way, Hebrew word of Cain's brother, Cain and Avel. In any case, that sense of nothingness or emptiness is another way of looking at it. Okay, so again, if the folks in the class who operated with this notion, again, just saw chaos winning, you know, and so all hell breaks loose when the misfit and some of them have everybody getting, you know, wiped out, and some of them just, but it doesn't make any sense. That was the kind of conclusion that they gave to the Flannery O'Connor. Then there was a group that gave, if you will, a more classical prophetic rendering of this. So let me just read a couple of verses from this. I'm going to jump to Isaiah 24. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left. Desolation is left in the city, the gates are battered into ruins, and thus it shall be on earth and among the nations, as an olive tree is beaten, as at the gleaning when the grape harvest is ended. On this mountain of the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples. Okay, notice this break. Well, let me stop here for a second. So this first image that the prophets lay out is an image which underscores judgment. The prophet is developing a very sharp kick in the pants. It's a wake-up call. It's a very strong cup of deliverer of caffeine, you know, that probably has some schnapps in it. It is pitched for those that are ethically smug and those who are complacent. And it culminates in this notion of there being a punishment for the iniquity that has built up and accumulated. Yeah.
So that's retributive justice all through the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
That is the God that, as Isaiah, who was a prophet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's but it's extremely important to realize that the judgment, there has to be justice really depends upon coming to terms with the impact of one's actions. So there's real continuity between the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament on this score, that there has to be a reckoning. There has to be a confrontation with what it is that one's deeds have done, the impact of one's performance. One can't do an end run around. One has to see the imprint that one has left. So what is being exposed here in terms of the judgment is there is the world has gone dreadfully awry, and it is essential to take responsibility for one's own role in creating the kind of disarray that is running rampant. So the first key element is this dynamic of judgment and confrontation. But after, on the other side of the judgment, if you will, there is this a message that delivers a sense of promise, a sense of newness, a sense that out of death can emerge new life. The end, if you will, clears the way to a new beginning. Out of the chaos, a new order begins to emerge. So there is a message in the prophets of a restoration that occurs, that there's a hope that begins to take shape out of the judgment. A new reality is beginning to kind of bubble up out of the ruins. And you see that in Isaiah 25, on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, a rich food filled with marrow of well-aged wines strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. Now, there were a number of kids in the class who had imbibed their Isaiah consciously or unconsciously. And how would you imagine they might have concluded the Flannery O'Connor story?
Grandmother gets her too.
Or the grandmother has to come to terms with the harm that she has wrought. So there's got to be a reckoning. And there also has to be a reckoning on the part of the misfit. So if you will, the world itself needs to be brought face to face with how dreadfully askew it is. But insofar as there is the encounter with the truth of themselves and the sharp, harsh judgment of that, there is a transformation that occurs, and if you will, they saw a kind of conversion being played out in which the misfit repents and changes of his way, and the grandmother does the same, and the rest of the family miraculously is transformed in the process of being a rather bland and ordinary nuclear family into being a vibrant, caring community. So there were those hopeful notions that, yeah, there's going to be a price that gets paid, but once the price is paid, there will be now a new continuity, a new possibility that will emerge. And then we come to the apocalyptic. Now, I'm sorry we don't have, again, more time to play out with the apocalyptic, but let me just share a couple of verses. Enoch would have been great, but Enoch's too long and complicated, so I chose a familiar segment from the book of Revelation. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no one was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud cry from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God, and he will be and they will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there any more. But the throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. And they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. So, what comes to, what leaps out at you from this more apocalyptic formulation, Rebecca?
So is the difference between this and Isaiah 25 and the emphasis on complete destruction before this new world can come about?
Yeah.
Very similar.
Yeah, there are. I think that's right. There's not a clear line separating, if you will, the prophetic from the apocalyptic. But what I would want to lift up here is, in both cases, a point is trying to be made that God is stronger than death. But above and beyond that, the prophetic underscores a sense of continuity. There is an earthiness about the prophetic and an attempt to reclaim and restore, rejuvenate this world and this people, this creation here and now. There's in one sense both an amplified sense of hope, but also an intensified feeling of despair within the apocalyptic. In other words, this world order is going to have to go. And it will be replaced literally from a divine reality will break in and, if you will, clear out what is old. And therefore, you have the same dynamics of judgment, but there is a cosmic battle that is being played out, not just between peoples and nations, but between these forces of light and darkness. And out of that battle, everything is reworked. Everything is refashioned. So the new descends from on high. I mean, literally, the city, the new city, descends from on high rather than being reconstructed out of the old fragments. And therefore, the replacement is a much more radical notion. Yeah, Dren?
You know, in the African American homiletic, there's a phraseology that goes like this: "He's a heart fixer and a mind regulator."
He's a heart fixer
and a mind regulator. That captures the sensibility of what the passage is.
Yes.
Because our hearts need fixing.
Yeah.
And our minds need regulating.
Yeah.
And that's a movement from the old, from the corrupted, as Paul calls it, to the uncorrupted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that newness is not so much something that's been, it's like the dialectic. the theses, antitheses, the synthesis is not an amalgamation, it's a brand new position.
Yep.
But it has both in it.
Yep.
And so that's what makes it new. Not that it's never been here before.
Yep.
But it's new because you're looking at it through a new set of eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a point that is debated and discussed. Does the apocalyptic emphasize or put the accent on discontinuity, which is to say, what's called for is so radically other that the world as we know it is going to have to get kind of wiped clean. It's going to have to be like the Noah story, and God's going to have to kind of wipe the slate clean. Or is it a case that no, hearts and minds and our own imaginations, our own ways of ordering the world are going to have to be transformed, and that calls for a radical interior reformation. So again, if you see the story in these more apocalyptic terms, then the encounter that takes place at the end of A Good Man is Hard to Find calls for a more radical encounter, and I would want to suggest that I think that Flannery O'Connor is working with an apocalyptic notion of what is demanded or called for. The way the story plays itself out, by the way, is that the misfits sidekicks take the family out and shoot them, and they're having a good old time, and the reason that they're having a good old time is because they're able to exercise unchecked power. And it's an orgy in which they can assert themselves over others. Then it's just terror. So then what happens is that when the grandmother hears the gunshots, there's this sense of a snapping of her imagination. And it describes her as her head, for the first time, comes clear. And she looks up into the eyes of the misfit, who is now wearing the shirt of her son. And she says, you're my child. She identifies him as one of her own. And then at that moment, the misfit pulls out his gun and shoots her in the head. The two sidekicks come up to the misfit. There's also a very interesting theological exchange that goes on between them, too, and you'll have to read that to see it. But the two sidekicks come up and say, isn't this great? I mean, this is really fun. And the misfit, whose worldview is also undergoing a transformation, says, shut up, there's no fun in this anymore. And they say, yeah, but, you know, look at who you shot. And his response was, she would have been a good woman if there had only been somebody there to shoot her every moment of her life. The point being that this sense of an ending, the sense of judgment, the sense of one being held accountable, the sense that the end is really near, it's about to burst in on you, is precisely what the imagination requires if it's going to be transformed. And so in a similar way with Flannery O'Connor's story, Ruby Turbin, I think, has an apocalyptic revelation at the end of the story. She has her way of seeing the world organized. We have till 9:30. She has a way of ordering the world, and that whole order is turned upside down, inside out, by the experience that she has. So what I would invite you to do at your small tables right now is to exercise your imaginations And as you think about the future, both in existential or personal terms, but also in terms of the society, American society, and in terms of the world at large in a more cosmic or global way, what is the sense of an ending that you have? Which does your which of these scenarios does your imagination glom onto? And which do you think is the scenario that has the greatest appeal in the popular imagination? So,
and you want yours back.
Yeah, there we go. So here are the questions at your table I invite you to play around with. So which of these descriptions comes closest to your own sense of the world's future? Now, the Bible, as we've laid out, makes room for it, it encompasses divergent visions about the end of days. Does each, are all three, what does it mean that there are multiple endings? There are different endings within the same text. Is there a sense in which there are insights that are unique to each worldview and that each is needed because they help correct or contest or challenge the others? And then finally, I think that each vision of the future recommends a certain way of living in the world, a certain way of life. What are the ethical, environmental, and economic patterns of life that you think would emerge from each of these visions of the ending? And which ending do you think needs to be highlighted for our own time and place? Okay, so that should give you a couple things to talk about. And then we'll come back and spend a moment or two on Ruby Turbin and her revelation, and then we'll turn it over to George, who will bring order from chaos. Mm-hmm.
The thing that I liked so much about the texts that Chris lifted up for us was that there's, as so often in the Bible, we found the text using ecological imagery time and time again to describe the future. And sometimes that imagery is devastating. Sometimes it's full of joy. We saw a couple of examples there. One of my favorite examples is from Jeremiah 12. The devastating part of the passage is, "Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion, my plot of land, my family farm. They have made my pleasant land a desolate wilderness." And then because the land had become desolate, the text continues, "They have sown wheat and reaped thorns. They have tired themselves out, but they profit nothing." Real devastation for an agrarian people. Other images are full of promise, like those from Isaiah 55, and we read a couple of those this morning. "Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be for the Lord a memorial, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off." And obviously that language is partly metaphor, and we hear it largely as metaphor for devastation or for an extraordinary success or an extraordinary human flourishing. But the images are powerful, and they carried that power in biblical times. They've carried that power for the Hebrew people. not just because they're beautiful images, but precisely because the people had experienced each one of those stages. They had experienced the hunger that goes with trying to live in a devastated landscape. They had experienced the flourishing of the land that is a feast of fine food and that is producing vines that will produce wonderful wine with which they can celebrate. So those aren't just images. They seem like images to us, but that's because we get our food from a grocery store and our wines from a liquor store. They had to produce them, and they got them from the land. And if the land did not flourish, they could not flourish. And so that image, that sense of connectedness with the land is just soaked into the Bible. And what I want to do today is to spend a few minutes taking what I'm going to call a biblical approach. I don't often call it that in the classes I teach at Hopkins, but I'm going to take a biblical approach and invite you to look at the future through the eyes of an ecologist, asking what we can read in the land today, just as the Israelites were so good at reading the signs of the land and sensing either impending disaster or impending a glorious existence looming in the future. So let's see if we can do as well. And I'm going to start, the basic question, I guess, is how are we doing? And from an ecological point of view, one of the basic measures of how well we're doing is called the ecological footprint. How many of you know the ecological footprint? Some do. It's basically the number, an accounting of the number of acres of land that we need in order to support the renewable resources that we consume. The acres of land, of cropland to produce the grain that we eat. The acres of grazing land to support the animals whose meat we're going to buy at McDonald's or your favorite purveyor of fine meats. The fishing ground that we need to supply the fish that we will consume. The acres of forest that will supply the timber we use to build our houses and our library shelves. And almost most importantly, the acres of vegetation that we need in order to absorb from the atmosphere the carbon dioxide that we're pumping out every time we drive out to ICJS or fly across the country to go to a wedding. And the green line at this point represents the Earth's capacity in terms of all of those kinds of land that we need. And we can tweak that a little bit, but really not very much, because, yeah, we can get more out of this cornfield, but if we're thinking on a global scale, there isn't a whole lot we can do about it. And the basic unit here is 1 Earth. The red line, of course, is the amount of land, the land equivalent that we have been consuming as we use renewable resources, starting back in 1960 and coming up to 2005. It's actually extended a little bit since then. The point of the line, of course, is that somewhere in the middle 80s, back in the 60s, we were doing pretty well. We were only using about half the available resources. Somewhere about the 80s, we began to use roughly what the Earth can supply. And since then, well, we're now somewhere around 40–45% more than the Earth can supply each year.
What does that mean?
That means we're consuming more than the Earth can supply what it means is it's very much like withdrawing more from your bank account than you get in interest each year. It's very much like an investment account. You can do it. You can get away with it for a while. You're not, this isn't an imminent disaster. But what it means is that in an investment account, you're drawing down your capital. So you're reducing the amount of income, interest income that you would get in future years. In an exactly analogous way as we sort of overgraze the pasture, to use the analogy, what we're doing is reducing the ability of the pasture, the earth, to support future generations.
Now, does entropy factor in that at all? But not for everything, but for some.
I wouldn't say entropy. You know, it's funny how making that comparison with an investment account, it's very much like our national debt in a sense. And people politically now are extraordinarily concerned about the amount we're borrowing on our national debt. But you don't hear nearly as much conversation about the natural capital that we're expending to support our way of life. The two are completely, well, not completely, but at the 99% level, the two are really comparable issues. And we're just looking at one side of the thing. The reasons for this, the reasons for that overshoot, of course, there are several, but one of the most obvious is the population growth in the world over that period of time. So there are just a whole lot more people sort of grazing the pasture, if you like, now. This is 1960. This is about the point where the curve started sharply upward in that last one. We're up here now. And the good news is that the population does seem to be leveling off, but the bad news is we're going to have like 9 or 10 billion people to support on this pasture in future years, and we have to figure out how to do that. The other, I think that's all very familiar to everybody here. The other part, and really the most important figure that I want to put up here this morning, is this one, which I have to take a moment to explain. This is plotting, the question is, in a sense, if we're consuming this, what are we getting for it? Are we getting an adequate return on the resources that we're investing in our own life? And so the question is, are we flourishing? Are we not flourishing? The question is, how do we measure human flourishing? And that's what the vertical axis here is supposed to indicate. It's one way of measuring human flourishing. The HDI refers to Human Development Index. It is composed of 3 features. The first one is GDP per capita. How much money are we generating? That, by the way, the statistics, we can imagine better ways of doing this, but these statistics are chosen because of their widespread availability. You can easily get these out of national accounting. So you can do a global accounting, global measurement of how well we're doing in Nigeria as well as how well we're doing in the United States or in Canada. So it's useful from that point of view. So the vertical axis is basically, it's just an arbitrary index from 0 to 1.2 at the top, showing this kind of measure of human flourishing. The horizontal axis is the per capita ecological footprint. And you can probably guess, there are 12 nations up there, all the nations over 100 million people, varying from the U.S. to Nigeria. They are in order, and by the way, this is about 68% of the global population, so it's fairly large, and it represents a wide variety of different ways of making a living, so in that sense, it's reasonably representative. It runs from Nigeria, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, China, Brazil, Mexico, the Russian Federation, European Union, Japan, and the US. And that sort of trajectory, you notice the implication of this. If you try to imagine yourself improving life down here, you can improve the Human Development Index and increase the level of human flourishing without very much increasing the ecological footprint. It's easy to do a fairly substantial, easy to increase human flourishing by a fairly substantial amount without any increase or any significant increase in the ecological footprint. As we begin to move from, say, India to China and then on to Mexico, there is a substantial increase in human flourishing, human development, but that comes at an increased cost in the ecological footprint. And you notice the big one here, as we move from, say, the European Union or Japan to the US, there's very, very little increase in the Human Development Index as measured here. By the way, I never quite finished my explanation of what the Human Development Index is. GDP is part of it. The big differences from the usual GDP measurement, though, are that life expectancy is a second major factor. And the third one, I think, is in the long run even more important. It's education. And what they're looking at is the number of grades on average that an individual 5 years old is expected to go through on average. Some people are going to go to graduate school. Some people are going to stop school maybe in the 6th grade. But on average for a country, how much schooling do people get? And the key there, of course, is that schooling is your chance to learn to read, to do arithmetic, to do the things that can help you develop further. So that's a huge investment in the potential of not just in how well that individual does, but in the potential of that individual to help the country improve to a better level. And they're also including adult literacy in that factor. So there are several things that are easy to get that I think are a fairly decent measure of how well we're doing. Now, the trick here, of course, is that we're already exceeding the world's biocapacity, but the problem is if India and China and Brazil all try to emulate the US style of living, we're in deep trouble. The usual calculation, the usual way of estimating it is going to take, say, 5 Earths to supply the resources that would be necessary in order to bring the rest of the world up to a US level of consumption. And the striking thing is that really wouldn't improve the Human Development Index anyway, as a measure of the quality of life, very much at all. Yeah.
This the U.S. at the 10 the economic footprint
Yeah.
capital 10.0.
Close to it.
Okay, close to 10.0 represents the. I'm going to just use this for my own brain. The amount of goods we consume.
Yeah.
And the way we do things.
Yeah.
And our lifestyle.
Right.
And we're the only ones in that quadrant.
We're the only ones that high on the hog.
High on the hog. That's
Yeah.
what I mean. And down here at the, I believe you said Nigeria, yeah.
Yeah.
Their index is close to 0.40 juxtaposed to ours at the half of what ours is.
It's less than half, but
Okay.
yeah.
Less than half. Yeah, it's less than half of what ours is. But the ratio in the ecological footprint means that they're supporting that community in a more proficient manner, or does that mean that the Human Development Index is, what does it mean? I don't know what it means.
Yeah, I think what it means is that down in this area, you're basically a peasant farmer way of living. And peasant farmers can live fairly well, as measured here. It's possible to sustain a decent, let me put it this way, perhaps the country, one way of thinking about it is that people like to stay below an ecological footprint of 2 hectares per person and be at about 0.8. There's one country in the world that is in that quadrant, and that's Cuba. Yeah. Cuba does extraordinarily well in terms of because they provide very good health care, and they're very good at literacy, but probably largely because they lost the oil that the Soviet Union was providing them, they do all of that at a very, very low environmental impact.
Now, I was in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And the density of the population, I was in Lagos, and in that area around the density of the population was overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm trying to equate that in my mind. The HDI doesn't necessarily reflect quality of living.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, it's supposed to.
Because people aren't doing good. I mean, they have all of these resources and stuff, but people aren't doing well. Because they're in these urban areas
and that's why they're the lowest of these 12 nations. Yeah, Rebecca.
An interesting comparison related to the point you made is the thing about Japan. It's also very densely populated.
Yeah.
But the standard of living is very high, but it only takes them half as much environmental impact to achieve the same standard of living.
But they import.
Japan.
Yes.
Yes, but they burn. See, it isn't the source. Okay, that's an interesting question. It isn't the resources that you have within your national boundaries that matter. It's how much you're consuming.
Okay, that clears it up for me.
Yep.
It's because the sensibility I have in the political science realm, that's my area, we call it carrying capacity. Current carrying capacity.
Within the national boundary. Yes. Yes.
And if you're not able to support that, then you got to bring it in.
Yeah. And this is not that.
That's not that. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Nigeria is one of those places that research is being taken from.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And third world countries being taken from if they're getting benefit.
Right.
That's it. Well, the whole of it is not getting benefit. There's some folks getting a lot of benefit because you have Victoria Island. I mean, you wouldn't know the difference between that and LA.
Yeah, and one big thing that isn't shown here that I think really needs to be included in a national accounting is the amount of inequality within that society, and that's not reflected here at all. This is just average. Yeah.
You mentioned GNP someplace along the line, and I think that one table we have from Adam Smith is how to arrive at cost. Supply and demand curve. And we do not include cost to health and the environment, a little dotted line up and put the point where the reality of cost is. Because we've talked about that.
Yeah, but this includes that because this includes the consumption as a cost, in effect. GDP does not include that. There are other ways of defining a figure like GDP that does involve the capital cost. But in a sense, this is built in because of the fact that that's shown as a cost on the horizontal axis, not on the vertical axis. Yeah, Angela.
I don't know, this is my question. Is the value of what they're doing, they're not actually going out and buying food necessarily, their subsistence funds and so on. And if you included the value of them, the education they're providing for their children or the food that they're going to feed themselves, does that bump them up in the HDI at all?
Not very much. I do not think. It is not included now because those are national GDP figures. But the amount of the cost of produce that a family would consume locally grown is probably not going to change those figures very much. Except if they eat healthy, then it'll be included in the longevity figure. So in one sense it is. So anyway, the yeah, let me just say, most of this comes out of a variety of sources, but the best presentation of the data, the most accessible presentation of the data, is put out by the World Wildlife Foundation in what they call the Living Planet Report, which they publish every couple of years. It's available free, it's on the internet. It's a PDF that's like 60 pages long. You can download it, read it. Lots of really good visual charts that help you to get your arms around it. And then there are references. There's also some very good stuff in Wikipedia on this. I'm not a huge fan of the accuracy of many Wikipedia articles, but this stuff is pretty good. Right about, in 1975, we were right about here. In 1960, I would guess we were about there. But we're following this trajectory steadily, which is, there's a small increase in HDI, but there's a huge increase in the environmental impact. So that's the general point here that I'm trying to make.
HDI is above 1.
Yeah, it is at 1.2 at the top here. Yeah, it can.
And your metaphor for utilizing our present debt situation, the end product is bankruptcy for us.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be. I hope it's only the metaphor.
If we continue where we're going.
Yeah.
Not going to be anything to go get.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing me back to that, because yeah, well, you see, who's going to bail us out?
Transformation of the mind.
Exactly. That was exactly the point that I wanted to go to. We can get away with this for a while. It's very difficult. People don't agree on how long we can get away with it. Just how imminent the bankruptcy isn't really all that clear. But it is fundamentally like an investment portfolio. We can get away with it for a while, but we're depleting our ability to maintain future generations. And the odd thing is that what's happening, of course, is that we're beginning to encounter the limits to Earth's ability to support us, our species. And the point that I really want to make today is that as we approach those limits, we find ourselves in a position that's remarkably like that of the Israelites as they tried to farm the hill country of Judea. And as some of you have heard me say before, farming in Israel must have been extraordinarily difficult for agronomists who just didn't have a DA, a Department of Agriculture agent, an extension agent to tell them how to do that. It's very difficult land. the soil is thin. It's unbelievably fragile. It's easily eroded. And the rain is sparse, and it comes in the wrong time of the year. What rain does come, comes in the winter, and those winter storms can be absolutely ferocious, just stripping all the topsoil from any field that lies bare. And trying to survive there must have been incredibly difficult. They didn't learn how to do this in Egypt. They had to figure it out. This was on-the-job training. And there must have been many, many failures, many hard years. But in the end, the Israelites learned how to do it. They learned how to terrace the hills. They replaced the lost nutrients in that soil by using animal waste. They kept the soil loose and permeable by allowing the land to lie fallow 1 year in 7. And the key lesson that the Israelites figured out in the course of all this was that they couldn't flourish. The people couldn't flourish unless the land flourished too. And that's a profound insight, one that we have seem to have completely forgotten, but it's expressed in dozens of biblical texts that deal with the confluence, the essential connectedness between human flourishing and flourishing of the land. That connection is very explicit in the agricultural laws of Exodus and Leviticus, which make two extraordinary demands. You know all this stuff, but just think for a moment how extraordinary it was that the land, it was mandated that the land should be allowed to rest 1 year in 7. These are people who were on the edge of hunger, and they figured out that they had to let the land rest. And they had to let the crops growing at the edges of the field, they could not harvest them. They had to leave them there so that people who had no land could harvest those crops, could glean those crops, and support themselves. And that must have been extraordinarily counterintuitive for people who were always living on the edge of hunger. The temptation to use all the land all the time, to gather in all the crops, must have been extraordinarily strong. And of course, commercial agriculture today does exactly that. Everything that commercial agriculture seems to do, and I'm not a farmer, but my perspective is that they're trying to maximize the yield all the time. That's the main effort. How can we get more out of this acre or this 1,000 acres of land? But the Israelites didn't do that, and I think they didn't do that because they realized that they were living in a very fragile land that they could very easily ruin by trying to farm that land too intensively. So they learned that the land had to be treated gently. The land had rights. They needed to care for the land lovingly. The resources of the land had to be shared with everyone, or they wouldn't have anyone to help them pick the crops at the end of the year. And that all, of course, got wrapped into a covenantal understanding, and the covenant applied to all. And that covenant, that sense of covenantal relationship between land, people, and God, we often think of this as Christians often think of the covenant as a bond between God and people. But there's a third member, very clearly, in the Hebrew Bible. The third member of the covenant is land. Land was a party, not property. Land was party to the covenant. And one of the passages that strikes me so much, I read something from Jeremiah 12 at the very beginning. Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They've trampled down my portion, made my pleasant portion a desolate place. And then the text continues. They have made it a desolation. Desolate. The land mourns to me, to God. The whole land has been made desolate, but no one takes it to heart. No one takes it to heart. And I think the implication, the way I hear that, is that God had a covenant with the land too. And since the people weren't taking care of the land, God had to take care of the land, hence the exile. You guys are out of here for 70 years until you figure this out. And that very clearly, Jeremiah describes the exile as a time for restoration of the land and redemption of the people. Restoration, if you like, of both land and people. I think that's a huge dynamic that's going on in the story of the exile. And that aspect of sacred trust, covenant with land, as well as people, is crucial. And we're missing it. And it seems to me that it was the very fragility of the land which they experienced. This wasn't an intellectual concept, they knew it. It was that fragility that taught the Israelites exactly how important it was that they care for the poor and that they care for the land. And I think we've allowed ourselves to be deluded by this sense, here in the States, we live in a land that seems to be so robust. And there has seemed for the past couple of centuries, to be so much of it that if we destroy this plot of land, we just move on to the next one. No big deal. We're getting to the point now where it's a very big deal. And we're beginning to realize that. We don't all get it yet. We don't all see it. But we're beginning to recognize that fact. In the last half century, our impact has been huge. And I think we're now finding ourselves in a position very much like the Israelites. A lot of people find that very threatening. I don't see that as a big threat. I see this as the thing that may tweak our image of things enough that we can shift back into something approximating the biblical understanding of the covenantal relationship, connecting all of creation, ourselves, and God in one binding relationship. And I think the secret is, mind you, I'm a geologist, so I'm obviously very prejudiced. But I think the secret is that we have to learn to read the signs of the land, the signs of nature, as perceptively, as wisely as the Israelites did. And that model is there for us, right in the Bible. We have to find ways of living that encourage all of us to live, that allow all of us to live, to flourish well. The ecological community and the human community, and especially the least of both communities. Not the best, not the top of both communities, but the least. And I think paradoxically, it's the very fragility of the Earth system that we're now beginning to recognize for the first time in modernity, at any rate, the limits that some of us find so threatening, so alarming. It's that very fragility, I think, I pray, that can give us, just as it did the Israelites, give us a deep sense of vocation and purpose and meaning that can be recovered from the biblical notion of the land as a sacred trust, given to us not as a gift, not as property, but as a sacred trust, a gift that we're privileged to use, provided we don't abuse it. So, and I think, Chris, you said right at the beginning that it's all a question of imagination. How do we bring a biblical imagination to understanding our situation and the potential and the futures that are implicit in the way we're living? And our imagination so far has tended to be a strictly economic, and I use that not in the sense of economics as a discipline, but as simply what's in it for us kind of imagination. We need a new way of looking at it. And one of the reasons why I feel that some of you know that I've been trying to use religious thought as a way of approaching environmental issues for a long time. This is one of the reasons I feel that this is such a gift, because it's all the basic form of imagination that's necessary, I think, to produce human flourishing is already there. The imagery, the ideas, the connectedness is all there. And it's up to us in the religious communities, not just the Christian community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and although I can't speak for other religious communities at all, I think many of the ideas are there as well. But it's up to us in the religious community to begin seriously living out of that sense of what can be. And not just going to church on our Sabbath, whatever our Sabbath happens to be, going to worship on our Sabbath, and saying the right things and doing, it's what we do when we come out of our worship services that matters. And we've got to have the courage to begin to do that. That's my own perspective. We're almost at the end of time. What I would like to do now is just sort of throw it open to you. And Chris lifted up some beautiful passages, some beautiful texts that I think are very relevant to what we're talking about and to this promised land that we have that is so fertile and that has produced us over 4.5 billion years. And what is our responsibility to that covenanted land? How do you read these texts in light of all of the ideas we've been circulating today? Or are there other texts that speak to you that you would like to lift up? Ted.
Yeah, George, there's a text that comes to me. Rabbi Jesus' disciples came to me one time, and they said, why do you speak in parables so much?
Yeah.
And he said, because hearing, they don't hear, and seeing,
they don't see.
They won't see.
Yeah.
Now, I have a little respect for the religious community, as most people here know, but most of us in the religious community are so engrossed in our lifestyle,
right,
in our way of living.
Right.
Where does your hope come from that the religious community is capable of the transformation that we need?
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
That's a daunting question, and for me, it speaks to the value that we place on biblical narrative in and of itself. My response would be, and that's not necessarily the answer, but my response would be that it's part of God's plan for us to carry it out. And in effect, if we get true to that plan and the adherence to it, then it will indeed be carried out. But we have created a pejorative view of both religion and the religious community that is not necessarily the characterization that comes out of God's sensibility of what it should be and what He created it to be. as much as it is our carrying out of it in a perverse way and drawing on our own content rather than looking to God's provision of what, of how we should behave and what we should believe.
This chart here, the Human Development Index, another way of measuring is the happiness index.
Yeah.
I know that's something that I know you're familiar with, but the idea of, the fact that we're using a lot of stuff and we're not getting much for it is pretty evident in that graph. It's the idea of flourishing, as a human on the planet. What is the cost of that to the planet? Usually, obviously, it's going to be less. So it's separating out what you're doing, trying to make decisions not to do something that's not good for you anyway, but will help. If you're part of a community, you tend to be a happier person. If you're in a close community that has to work together to solve its problems, your happiness goes up. So I think doing things in community, which is something churches are good at, and have become less good at lately, as is shown by attendance drop. If bringing our communities together toward a common purpose of simply being together as a replacement for going out and spending money or consuming, there's something to be said about that.
Yeah. And coming back to Ted's question, obviously hope is all about things that we don't see. So I'm going to use that as partly as an escape hatch. But the other part that is, well, and of course part of it too, my own hope is born of the sense of promise, not in the sense of commitment, but in the sense of possibility. That there's a huge promise, a huge potential that I see in the religious sensibility, the religious imagination. And I do see such a lack of, such anguish at the lack of meaning in life, in young people today. And that's tragic. But on the other hand, the potential is, I see the possibility of their discovering meaning in this kind of way of taking responsibility for the world, for using the world responsibly. Many of them are, from a secular point of view, beginning to do that. So there's the possibility there of a confluence. And I think the Christian community has tended to see Christianity in way too individualistic terms, personal salvation. And I think that is what is turning off the younger generation. And the possibility that there could be more to and I'm speaking now as a Christian, not as a Jewish person, but the same thing, I think, is the same promise is certainly there in Judaism. I don't think the distortion is quite as strong in Judaism, but I may just be missing it. But I think there's a potential confluence there between the meaning that's implicit in this more communal sense of what religion is about and even the Occupy movement.
Can I comment?
Please.
Again?
Please.
And on your confluence word. Another time Jesus' disciples came to him and they said, there are all these people out and they're talking your message and they're healing,
yeah.
but not in your name.
Thank you.
And you know what Jesus said.
Yeah.
So why can't we take that approach?
Exactly, Ted. Thank you.
He said, those who are not against me are for me.
Yeah.
In other words, let's not be sectarian.
Yeah.
Let's expand our message and our fellowship.
Yeah.
And our acceptance.
if you're endowing responsibility for young people to take on the idea of bringing the community back and bringing a new sense of what a religious life can look like, you have to give them the authority to. You can't keep the authority and tell them when they're going wrong. You have to adapt.
George, there's another text. I never thought about this until you said what you said. And, I mean, you wrote so many contrasting metaphors. It's the Eucharist text found in 1 Corinthians in the 11th chapter, where the folks who had great resources, were going in before the people who
Right.
had the word,
Right.
and eating up all the food and getting
Right.
drunk,
Right.
which is a consumption
Right.
and the greed and cultural nuance that we observe. I never thought about it in this way, and I've dealt with this text so many times, but I never thought about it as a metaphor. I actually used it because then it comes to the portion of Paul's, retribution against this kind of behavior, and then he says, "You got to examine yourself."
Yeah.
Everyone needs to examine themselves before they come to. And so that's the whole piece of us coming to a different way of thinking about what we're doing and how we're not making the table available to everybody.
Exactly.
Because we have more resources. We get there first. We're going to use them all up.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it strikes me, George, as I reflect on your comments and presentation, that you're very much operating out of a prophetic sense of an ending. That there is continuity between the world to come, the world that we are called to create, the culmination of the creation, entails its preservation and its honoring, its validation, its a covenantal commitment, and therefore fantasies or dreams about a radical discarding of the old in order to make space for a new heavenly realm strikes me as one that stands in contrast to what your views, where your musings are taking.
Mm-hmm.
And the point I'm trying to make is not only is there a challenge, it seems to me, in terms of breaking the grip of individualism and the notion of constructing salvation in terms of heavenly reward for the individual. Not only do we need to break out of that and move in a much more, not only communitarian, but an ecologically complete,
Right.
but also I think our very conceptions of God may need to be radically reconsidered. And as a Presbyterian who tends to emphasize the sovereignty of the divine and ultimately think of us, God's in charge, that the vulnerability of God that seems to me to emerge from your presentation requires a paradigm shift. That God needs us in a way that would make Calvin go ballistic. That in some fundamental way, this project is very tenuous. It's covenantal, and it entails responsibilities that are huge for us. And that we can't expect a God, as we see in Revelations, simply coming in at the end and fixing it all, and if you working it out over our heads, dropping it from on high. That conception may be a fantasy that we have to own up to and confront. Anyway, in a nutshell, I would say, I said dueling eschatologies or dueling visions of the end. They may be complementary. I mean, we may indeed find that we need to hear those different voices. But in my own life, there are times when I feel much more resonance with Ecclesiastes. I mean, it just feels as though nothing's adding up.
Yeah.
There are other times when the prophetic imagination lays claim, and frankly, there are times when it seems to me the apocalyptic is precisely the whack in the head that's
two before.
The grip of the cultural.
Chris, have you ever thought that the things that don't add up from the Ecclesiastes passages are couched in a reflection that we need to make, that we're not that important, that it's not all about us after all. It's about something greater than us, because I think that's where the contextual part comes in Ecclesiastes. Vanity, vain. Be vain is to think that your stuff is over the top, but it's not.
I think we need to make time to move on, but you've had your hand up for quite a while, and I wanted to give you a chance.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up the text of the Book of Ruth, and just a bit of insight from the Jewish perspective of Messianic consciousness. So, throughout the Torah, throughout the Bible, we get news about the humility of the concept of the Messianic age by the ancestors of the lineage. And Ruth is an example of how someone who comes from what society deemed to be less than admirable background, then kind of adopts a kind of consciousness and comes into a kind of social structure that can give us a hint of where we can envision a messianic consciousness or a messianic leader. What I find quite beautiful in the concept of Ruth is they bring up this Hebrew word which is davka, and davka, or the noun zvekut, is a very mystical concept in Kabbalah or in Judaism around cleaving to God, like being in this kind of union with God. And how do we see that in the story? We see it not by her kind of going through some conversion that is, following certain esoteric rules, but her experience of going into the biblical structure of what he was saying is directly into agriculture, into the way that the agricultural life or the relationship between land and the people and God then provides for the people. And she's an example of that, of how that's kind of the first place that I think we learn about being.
Right.
And finally, with that, the Jewish concept of Messiah is always about us bringing the Messiah. What that means is exactly those kinds of hints.
Right.
What is it about the actions of the ancestors that then continued the lineage? What is it about her reality that then gave birth to the next generation, and how can we learn from that to bring the messianic consciousness and be at a place that's ready to recognize a leader who stands up and wants to speak the truth? Because I think in this contemporary consciousness, we won't recognize that leader. We won't make that person president because he or she is not speaking to our economic needs.
Right.
That's powerful.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming, being here, and for contributing today so richly.
I wanted to say amen after each of your talks. So next week we have Dr. Sylvia Nasser here, who is going to be speaking on the economy. George has been working with her quite closely to figure out what she's going to talk about. She's written a book called The Grand Pursuit, which is what she's mostly going to be referencing, I believe. But you may also know her. Many of you saw the film A Beautiful Mind, the story of John Nash. She wrote a book that was the basis for that film as well. She's at Columbia School of Journalism, and will be coming out to talk to us about the economy of all things after we just talked about
Well, not to be missed.
Right. Yeah. So she's good.
Yeah, she's. It's an interesting take. You'll see from the materials that will be distributed later on. That book takes a look at the sweep of the last 150 years of economic theory and tries to make the case that economic theory is really more and more about human flourishing. It's not just exploitation. It's about much more than exploitation. And so she's really revisioning a way of seeing economics that I think is extraordinarily important in terms of trying to make the connection, trying to lift up a new imagination, if you like, that I find hopeful.
Maybe